Hi, my name's Alex Mesoudi. I'm Professor of Cultural Evolution at the University of Exeter, and this is my talk entitled Archaeology within a Unified Science of Cultural Evolution. So this talk was due to be given as part of the Garrod seminar series on cultural evolution at Cambridge University's Department of Archaeology in November 2023. Sadly, I couldn't make it to give the talk, but the organizer, Simon Carignon, has kindly asked me to record the talk in order to put it up alongside the other fascinating talks in the series. Okay, so my talk has three parts. In the first part, I'll talk briefly about how I see cultural evolution theory broadly and its key components. In the second part, I'll talk about two lab experiments that I've done in the past, fairly old now, but the part of my work that's most related to archaeology, where we try to recreate patterns in the archaeological record using psychology lab experiments. And finally, some remarks about how I see archaeology fitting within a broader, unified science of cultural evolution that links across different branches of the social and biological sciences. Okay, so firstly, how I see cultural evolution theory. So imagine, if you will, Darwin as a chef, not a literal chef, given what he was reported to have eaten during his time at Cambridge, weird and wonderful species, probably he would make a terrible chef, but a scientific chef who, in the Origin of Species, came up with a recipe for evolution. So basically he outlined the key components that you need in order to have evolution. And in the Origin of Species, these components he laid out were firstly variation, secondly inheritance, and thirdly selection. And so firstly, and he applied these principles to biological species, of course. So there's variation in different individuals within a population, variation in a bird's beak size or neck length or whatever. There's some kind of inheritance, so individuals inherit their traits from their parents. We now know genetically, Darwin had little idea about how genetic inheritance works, but there's some kind of inheritance from one individual to another, from parents to offspring. And finally, there's some kind of selection, differential fitness, such that not all variants are equally likely to persist from one generation to the next. And basically how I see cultural evolution is applying these three principles, these elements of Darwin's recipe for evolution, to cultural change rather than genetic change. So we can think about variation in cultural traits, variation in words, norms, attitudes, beliefs, knowledge, skills, artifacts, and so on. These things are inherited, not genetically, but we're thinking now of cultural inheritance or inheritance via social learning. So these cultural traits being transmitted via imitation, by spoken or written language, by teaching, and so on. And finally, there's some kind of selection, by which we simply mean not all cultural traits are equally likely to be transmitted to subsequent individuals. And this selection is a very broad category that can be due to various factors that I'll expand on in a moment, but broadly we can think of them as social, material, and demographic. A quick note that we don't necessarily have to have technically selection. Darwin talked a lot about it and talked about natural selection, but I guess biologists since have emphasized how you don't necessarily need selection for evolution to take place. So if you just have variation and inheritance, then essentially you have drift, changes due to random, non-selective processes, and in biological evolution, this is genetic drift. In cultural evolution, this would be cultural drift. I mention this because models of cultural drift have been quite important in archaeology in particular. And one of the experiments that I'll talk about links to cultural drift. But I guess selection is where lots of the interesting things happen, and let me say a bit more about how I see these selective forces in cultural evolution from occurring. So by social factors, I mean factors that cause changes in the frequency of cultural traits or changes in cultural variation as a result of who we choose to learn from, or biases in who we choose to copy. So three examples are payoff bias, prestige bias, and conformity. The payoff bias would be where we preferentially copy individuals who have high payoff, high success. However, success is measured in a particular society. It could be something like hunting yield or reproductive success or wealth. And so here we have a toy archaeological example where you have different potential demonstrators who are using different projectile points or arrowheads, and they have different hunting yields. So this guy has a higher hunting yield than the others, and so payoff bias would be preferentially copying the projectile point of the guy who has the highest hunting yield. Prestige bias is related but slightly different. It's copying individuals who have high social status, which may or may not be correlated with their payoff, their objective measures of success. But prestige is more about using cues, say, of deference, that other individuals in society are paying deference to particular individuals and preferentially copying those prestigious individuals, as this person did. And conformity is more based on the frequency of the trait in the population. So it's preferentially copying traits that are most common, or being disproportionately more likely to copy traits that are more common in your particular group. And so in this case, the dark red trait is more frequent than the green trait, and so this conforming individual is preferentially adopting the most common trait. Material factors, on the other hand, are more about the intrinsic qualities of the trait that is being transmitted rather than who is being copied. So, for example, physical factors might specify the raw materials that a particular trait is made out of, artifact is made out of. So steel axes might be more durable, easier to use, have better cutting power than stone axes, and so over time tend to increase in frequency due to the intrinsic qualities of the trait. Similar to payoff bias, but now we're copying effective specific traits rather than individuals who have high payoff, which again may not necessarily be the same process. By psychological factors, I mean aspects of cultural traits that are more psychologically attractive, and we can think in terms of the cognitive processes that make some traits more attractive than others. Thinking in terms of arrowheads, this is an example taken from this Thompson and Griffiths paper from a couple of years ago, where we might experiment with different shapes of, these are supposed to be arrowheads, and as they're transmitted over time, people might have a prototype arrowhead shape, which is kind of pointy and triangular, which they transform these traits, transform the arrowheads into over successive generations. There are some traits that are just psychologically more intuitive, more appealing. And finally, ecological factors might describe a case where some traits are just more suited to some environments than others. Some points, projectile points, might be more suited to rabbits, and other projectile points might be more suited to deer, and so the cultural trait is favoured differently in different ecologies. And finally, demographic factors describe aspects of the broader society, the size and structure of the population within which people are learning and within which traits are being transmitted. So lots of work, again with links to archaeology, has looked at population size, arguing that more complex cultural traits, more effective cultural traits can culturally evolve in larger populations because there are more people coming up with new innovations. Traits are less likely to be lost accidentally as people die or forget things, and so larger populations maintain higher cultural complexity. Max Derricks has done some great work, experimental and theoretical, arguing that actually even better is a population structure that has different subpopulations, semi-independent from each other, connected by migration. And so each one, in each subpopulation, that group will experiment with different ideas, and then you can recombine the best ideas that each group has come up with through partial migration to produce even more complex cultural traits. And finally, lots of work recently in cultural evolution on social networks, so thinking about within the groups rather than just their size and how they're linked via migration. Think about sparsely connected populations, you can think about fully connected populations, and you can think about things like small world networks and which ones of these characterize different human societies and how this affects the transmission of cultural traits. And one of the major, I think, benefits of a cultural evolution framework is that it encourages us to think about the population level effects of these factors, of these social, material, and demographic factors. We can think about what consequences do these different biases, do these different factors have at the population level and over long periods of time. And this is just exactly what happens in evolutionary biology, where biologists think in terms of individual level processes like mating and conflict and cooperation, and think about how these processes scale up to the population level over long periods of time. And just as in evolutionary biology, in cultural evolution, we use formal models to make this link. I think formal models are essential for this because thinking about the population level consequences of all of these different factors is very difficult for unaided human minds. And that's kind of why at the core of the field of cultural evolution are lots and lots of formal mathematical and computational models. One example of this from my own recent work on conformity and migration, we can think about what effect migration and conformity, but we'll think first about migration here. What effect do these processes have on between-group cultural variation? So it's very simple, almost like a thought experiment, but very simple simulation I've got here on the screen, where we've got 4 different groups. We're starting off at the very beginning of the simulation, where with each group having a different cultural trait. So the colors here indicate different cultural traits. We've got a red trait, an orange trait, a green trait, and a blue trait. And we're starting off with groups being maximally distinct. So everyone in the first group is red, everyone in the second group is orange, and so on. And we're going to simulate this, and we're going to add a very small amount of migration between these 4 groups. So each time step randomly, with a 1% chance, an individual will move with their trait to another group. And here we've got no conformity, so there's just migration. And if I start the simulation, you can see what happens. Individuals are moving from group to group, and because the migration is random and because they're taking their traits with them, gradually the nice between-group cultural variation, between-group structure that we started with is gradually being broken down, even with a relatively small migration rate. Just to show that a bit more formally, sped up and with a measure of between-group cultural variation. So this is a measure you'll see on the graph on the right here of cultural FST, same as geneticists use to measure group structure, genetic group structure, but we can have a cultural FST. So this is the degree to which groups are different, the degree to which variation lies between groups rather than within groups. And if I start the simulation here, we can see over time this very small migration rate leads to the rapid loss of cultural FST, loss of between group cultural structure, and all the variation ends up within groups. So now we add conformity to the simulation, so same migration rate as before, but now after individuals move from one group to the other with their trait, they conform. So they're disproportionately more likely to adopt the most common trait in the group that they move to. This is relatively weak conformity. So we have this conformity parameter A, which if it's 1, as it was on the previous slides, there's no conformity. Whereas as it gets larger, conformity gets stronger and stronger. So it's just 1.1, so relatively weak conformity. But we can run this and see what happens, and we see that with even just very weak conformity, we maintain the between-group cultural variation that we start with. There's really no noticeable drop in cultural FST. So I guess I'm presenting this model just to illustrate how it's an extremely simple model with just discrete traits and random migration and just conformity is happening, but I think it has interesting interesting insights, given that many of these patterns are kind of unintuitive. So a very small migration rate rapidly breaks down between group cultural variation. Well, in the world that we live in, there's rapid migration, yet there's quite distinct cultural variation between different groups. And so we need to think about what processes might stop between group variation from occurring and stop all world cultures becoming one homogeneous identical mass. Well, this conformity process may be one potential candidate process for doing that, because you really don't need very strong conformity at all in order to maintain realistic levels of cultural variation. And that's one of many models that you can find in this tutorial that I have up, which is free to access, free to use. Lots of models of cultural evolution going all the way from bias transmission biases, social learning biases that I was talking about, through to migration, demography, historical dynamics, social contagion, social networks, many of those different ideas. I take you through key models in cultural evolution so you can understand for yourself how these different processes work and how they translate up to the population level. And on the right here is a book that Alberto Acerbi, Marco Smola, and myself wrote as a follow-up to the free online tutorial. Either will work. Paul Smaldino also has a very good agent-based modeling book that you can use. But really, I think to understand the theoretical basis of cultural evolution, it's really useful to run through these simulations and see exactly how the different factors at the individual level translate up to the population level. Okay, so that's the kind of core ideas of cultural evolution as I see them. Others obviously have different schemes and emphasize different aspects, but I think broadly thinking in terms of the processes that change cultural variation over time is really, and the population level consequences of those processes is really at the heart of cultural evolution. So now to lab experiments trying to understand archaeological patterns. So the first study was with Marius Kemp and Stephen Lysett, and here we actually weren't looking at any of those selective forces. We were looking at cultural drift. So what would we expect in the absence of any of those interesting factors, where all that's operating is the introduction of random variation and the transmission of that variation without any directional change over time. This is just as important really as studying selection, because in order to detect selection we need to know what it would look like, what cultural change would look like without selection, so that we can recognize selection when it happens. In this study, we also wanted to add a layer of psychological realism to cultural drift models. So rather than just assuming random change, thinking about what random change actually means given the psychological and perceptual constraints of of humans, of our brains, of our visual systems. So in this study, this experiment, we tested a theoretical model. Again, it's based on a formal model that Erkens and Lippo produced back in 2005, called the accumulated copying error model. So this is all about artifact size of shapes in general, but here applied in an archaeological context to the size of an artifact. And if you look at these two handaxes, obviously the handaxe on the right is larger than the handaxe on the left. But the interesting thing from psychophysics is that there is a threshold below which, of size difference, below which we can't perceive difference. So the handaxe on the right here is actually 3% bigger than the handaxe on the left, but you probably, if you have a visual system like everybody else in the world, can't tell that the handaxe on the right is bigger, because this so-called Weber fraction is below the threshold that our visual systems need in order to tell the difference between two artifacts. So this is well known from psychophysics, that there's this threshold of size perception, size difference perception. What Erkens and Lippo did was put it in a transmission context. So now imagine you have a chain of handaxe nappers trying to reproduce the handaxe of a teacher, previous generation, exactly. And so again, there's no directional change here. We're assuming that individuals are trying to transmit, are trying to copy something exactly with no change at all. And imagine this happens over successive generations or successive teacher-pupil pairings. And imagine that because of our perceptual threshold, because of our Weber fraction, we accidentally, or the next napper accidentally makes their hand axe 3% bigger than the hand axe of the teacher, which is plausible because this is the percentage that we can't tell any difference between. And then imagine that the next pupil in the teacher-learner chain makes their hand axe slightly bigger, 3% bigger, again imperceptible to human eyes, so quite easy to do. The next person in the chain makes their hand axe accidentally 3% bigger, the next person 3% bigger, and you can see that gradually it's got bigger over time. Each specific step in the chain is imperceptible, but if we bring the first and the final hand axes together, now we can see hopefully that the hand axe on the right is bigger. But it's the accumulated copying error from of successive generations that is causing this. And if you again scale that to the population level, scale that over many generations and lots of replicate populations to check what's going on, Erkens and Lippo found that over time this accumulated copying error, assuming this 3% random perceptual error, causes the mean, the average size of an unspecified artifact to not change over time. So the mean doesn't change over time because in the example I just showed you, it was getting bigger, but some chains may get bigger, some chains may get smaller, some chains might get bigger and then smaller. So it all evens out. But the coefficient of variation increases, it goes up. So chains diverge, but on average they don't. The mean doesn't change. So what? But I guess the problem with this model is that this 3%, plus or minus 3%, this Weber fraction, comes from psychophysics experiments using lines and abstract shapes and very small participant sizes. It's a curiosity of psychophysics that they often have an n of 1 or 2, and maybe just the experimenter tests it himself or herself and makes conclusions based on that. So what we wanted to do is test this accumulated copying error in an explicit archaeological context. So we wanted to ask in our study, does this plus or minus 3% perceptual threshold also apply to artifact shapes rather than sort of abstract triangles or lines that psychophysicists often use? We also wanted to ask, is everyone's Weber fraction plus or minus 3%, given the very small sample sizes in psychophysics experiments? And also, are there emergent effects when extended over many people? So again, psychophysics experiments just test one person. We wanted to test transmission of artifacts, transmission of shapes from one person to another over many chains. So we had an iPad task where participants were tasked with resizing a hand axe image to match a target hand axe. So we got rid of all of the motor aspects of making an artifact, and we're just focusing on the perceptual aspect of reproducing an artifact here. So obviously that's completely unrealistic. There's all kinds of motor constraints and skill-based variation, but we wanted to just isolate the perceptual aspect of cultural transmission in this particular experiment. So we had a hand axe appear on the screen for the participant. The participant got their own hand axe, which in this case was very big, so maximum size, and they could resize their hand axe to try and make it exactly the same size as the target hand axe on the left. So we skewed them a little bit in the vertically, just so they couldn't line it up with their eyes, so they had to judge it a little bit. And then this resized hand axe served as the target for the next participant in the chain. And so the next participant came along and they did their resizing and so on along the chain. So we repeated this over 10 generations, each person resizing the target hand axe that came from the previous person in the chain. And we ran 10 independent chains and averaged across them like independent runs of the model to see what would happen over each of these chains. Because we weren't sure really whether to make the initial hand axe very large or very small. We did both. So half of the chains were shown very large initial hand axes, like I showed you in the video. The other half were shown very small initial hand axes. We didn't really expect this to make much of a difference. We just had to make a choice. But there kind of was a difference. So the overall error, to start with, the overall error was 3.43%, so fairly close to Weber's fraction there, slightly over, but that's kind of reasonable. Interestingly, when the initial image was large, then the error was smaller, so about 2.69%. When the initial image was small, then the error was 3.99%, so slight difference there in the Weber fraction based on whether the initial image was large or small. But whether it, in both of those conditions, variation increased as predicted. So this graph shows variance in size relative to the initial size at 0, with generation in the chain along the x-axis. And the dotted line shows what you would predict based on the Weber fraction, Weber percentage that we measured, and the solid line shows the actual increase in variation. So the chains did get different. The chains diverged over time as predicted based on the Erkens and Lippo model. But if you look at the mean, overall they stayed the same, but again we got this interesting effect of the initial size of the hand axe. So initially large hand axes got larger, and initially small hand axes got smaller, which we weren't expecting. So kind of, I guess that's the point of doing experiments. You find interesting effects that models don't incorporate. But overall, the mean didn't really change, but we saw these differences. So to summarize that study, perceptual error in the experiment was around 3%, matching quite well the psychophysics literature. So I think it's justified to use Weber's fraction as a prediction for how artifacts might change over time, purely in response to perceptual error, if we want to isolate that process from others. Real-life variation in Acheulean hand axe size from about 1.5 to 0.3 million years ago, we managed to measure, is 20 times smaller than predicted by the accumulated copying model, error model, with our measured 3.43% Weber fraction. So the model is predicting that hand axes should be much bigger, I guess, in those lineages where it's plus 3%, plus 3%, plus 3%, and so on. Those lineages get very, very large, but actually we don't see anywhere near that size in the actual archaeological record. I guess that's kind of obvious because you do find massive hand axes, but most hand axes, the ones that we used, have to fit into your hand, and so there are sort of functional constraints that are limiting the size of different hand axe lineages, and so we thought there must be some kind of stabilizing selection due to those functional constraints that are stopping some hand axe lineages from getting very, very big. At some point, people see that they're too big, and this unexpected effect of initial hand axe size potentially has possible implications for, we thought, additive versus reductive tool traditions. So if we think about something like basketry or even pottery, where you're adding things to, you're adding clay to a pot, or you're adding reed to a basket, we can think of that as additive rather than reductive, which would be stone knapping, where you start with a large block of stone and you're taking pieces off it to get to a target. Maybe you can see our large initial hand axe versus small initial hand axe as equivalent to additive versus reductive, whether you're starting with nothing and building it up, or whether you're starting with a large thing and reducing it down. Maybe that might have implications for differences between additive versus reductive tool traditions that we followed up in another study. Okay, so the second study that I'll briefly talk about looks at the social factors that I talked about, this payoff bias, prestige bias, conformity, specifically payoff bias. So preferentially copying individuals who have a high relative payoff. So this study, or our experiment, again sought to simulate an archaeological pattern, archaeological phenomena. In this case, an earlier study by Bob Bettinger and Jelmer Erkens, who studied projectile points, arrowheads, in the Great Basin from around 300 to 600 AD. And they noticed an interesting pattern in the projectile points that they had in their collection that they analyzed, which is that in central Nevada, from around the same time period, same raw material in this case, probably potentially the same use, in central Nevada, there were a small number of uniform types. So lots of arrowheads were of one set of dimensions, lots of other arrowheads at a different site were a set of different dimensions, but there was lots of uniformity within these different assemblages. And whereas in Eastern California, there was lots of diversity and no noticeable uniformity. Just in all sites, there was lots and lots of diversity without any group structure, without any patterns. And this can be measured in terms of the correlations between the different key dimensions of the projectile point. So here we have width, thickness, and weight and length of the projectile points in this table, and the numbers here are correlation coefficients between those different dimensions in green in California and in red in Nevada. And you can see in each of the pairs of attributes, the correlations between those attributes in Nevada is higher than the correlation between the same pair of attributes in California. So higher correlations means there's lots of arrowheads in Nevada are long and thin, whereas in California some are long, some are thin, some are long, some are thick, and there's much less correlation between the different attributes of the projectile points. And what interested me in this particular study is that they explain, Bettinger and Erkens explained this pattern, this difference between Nevada and California in terms of the social factors that they thought might be responsible for transmitting the projectile point designs in the prehistoric populations. So they argued in Nevada, arrowhead designs spread via payoff bias that we've already come across. So imagine there's a arrowhead maker who uses a design, and this person has a higher payoff than everybody else in their group. And so if people are employing payoff bias, then they would be copying this high payoff trait from this high payoff individual, and that generates uniformity in the particular group. So lots of people having the same cultural trait. In California, on the other hand, Bettinger and Erkens argued arrowhead designs spread via guided variation, which I haven't mentioned yet, but is basically transmission plus individual experimentation. So you copy a trait from another individual, then you try different things in order to try and improve it over time. And so initially, maybe learners were copying the arrowhead design of a single individual, but then modifying it in different ways, trying to improve it, experimenting with it, which led to the variation across the whole Californian site. So this was Bettinger and Erkens' hypothesis for why the Nevadan arrowheads were much more uniform than the Californian arrowheads. And that then generated these differences in correlations. But is that the case? I guess there was a hypothesis that they suggested. Obviously, we can't go back in time and see prehistoric people copying arrowhead designs from each other. But what we can do, next best thing, is run experiments to try and recreate those patterns, to see if it's psychologically plausible that people would, firstly, follow those different biases, the conditions under which they would follow those biases, and whether we see the same kinds of population level patterns, in this case, correlations between projectile point characteristics, as we see in the archaeological record. So this work with Mike O'Brien, who gave another talk in the Garrod seminar series from a few years ago, sought to simulate this Bettinger and Erkens scenario. So we had a computer game where people could design their own arrowheads by modifying the same characteristics that Bettinger and Erkens, mostly the same characteristics that Bettinger and Erkens measured in their study. And this is an individual learning phase condition of the experiment, where people could just change the height, the width, the thickness, the different shape and color of the arrowheads, and you can see height, width, and thickness are continuous here, shape and color are discrete traits, and then you can go virtually hunting and get bits of bison and feedback in terms of calories. And so the aim here with individual learning is trying out different values and trying to find the best, the optimal arrowhead design that maximizes your calorie return on different hunts. It's the interesting aspect is when we also run payoff bias social learning conditions to test that other hypothesis of Bettinger and Erkens, which is where people are in groups of 6 and they can see everybody else's score. So this person is player 3 here, and you can potentially view the arrowhead design of other players who over a period of time have been learning in the same environment as you and have their own arrowhead design. And this person has conveniently followed payoff bias social learning because they're copying player 1 here, who has the highest score in the group at that point, and they can see that they're shown player 1's arrowhead attributes, and they can potentially copy them, which this person has done almost exactly and has done very well out of payoff bias social learning. So what we did, we had individual learning, so guided variation phases, we had social learning phases, and I guess we also, the nice thing about experiments is that we can manipulate and control the fitness functions, the fitness landscape. So in this experiment we have multiple traits, the height, width, thickness, shape and color. Some of them are continuous, some of them are discrete. Color was actually neutral, which we added just for interest, as almost as an afterthought. So color didn't actually have any effect, but the continuous traits and shape did determine the score that people got in the game. And of most interest, the continuous traits had bimodal fitness functions, which I won't go into in too much detail, but the overall fitness, the overall calorific return of an arrowhead is the sum of these 3 bimodal fitness functions, which generates a multimodal adaptive landscape. So there are lots of different locally optimal arrowhead designs. So if you converge on one of these local optima, it appears like you're at the optimum. So any small change in your arrowhead design reduces your score, but there's always a single best possible arrowhead design somewhere in the landscape that we don't tell participants anything about the landscape or the multimodal fitness landscape. But that generates an interesting almost trap for individual learners, because if you're just individually learning, you might find yourself stuck at a locally optimal but globally suboptimal peak. But then payoff bias social learning allows you to jump to the peak that another participant has found that might have higher fitness. So it creates a more interesting experimental challenge. I guess in the context of this experiment, though, we were interested in simulating payoff bias and guided variation, the 2 hypothesized mechanisms that Bettinger and Erkens proposed. And so we did this where in some conditions we allowed payoff bias social learning, allow people to copy based on payoff. In other conditions we didn't allow copying after the start, so we allowed them to copy one person at the very beginning, but then the rest of it was individual learning. And this is what we generated after many trials of hunting and lots of learning. So at the top here we got the actual prehistoric Great Basin data, these different correlations in green and red. At the bottom here in the large table is our experimental data, again divided up into our pairs of traits in the experiment, and the green correlations are the guided variation condition. The red correlations are after payoff biased social learning, and you can see in almost all of the cases, all but one of these cases, the red correlations, the red payoff bias correlations are higher than the green guided variation correlations, nicely recreating the archaeological pattern that Bettinger and Erkens obtained, where in all of the Nevadan correlation coefficients were higher than all of the Californian correlation coefficients. So that lends support to Bettinger and Erkens' hypothesis that these actual correlations between the different sites were due to differences in learning dynamics between those sites, with Nevada relying more heavily on payoff biased social learning, and in California, learners were relying more on guided variation, doing more exploration. Note also that color showed the same pattern as the other traits. I noted that color is neutral, had no effect on the arrowhead payoff, the score that people got, yet color showed exactly the same pattern except for this color and width. The others, the color correlations were higher in the payoff bias condition compared to the guided variation condition. So, just to summarize that study, our experiment supports Bettinger and Erken's hypothesis for variation in arrowhead diversity in prehistoric North America as being due to differences in learning dynamics, learning modes in the two sites. It's not obviously not conclusive proof. Many other alternative hypotheses for those kinds of patterns, but at least it lends plausibility to this, and people readily engaged in payoff bias and guided variation, so these are not psychologically implausible processes to suggest that prehistoric people were using. The neutral trait that we added as an afterthought, color, kind of hitchhiked along with functional traits, so it's kind of melding more into prestige bias maybe. People are not evaluating the payoff of the particular traits, they're copying the payoff of the individual, and some traits may not actually be contributing to the overall payoff of an individual, and so we can see neutral traits as hitchhiking along with functional traits, which may well be a common pattern in the archaeological record, not detected by Bettinger and Erkens, but in other cases. And this result crucially depends on this multimodal fitness landscape that I mentioned. So if there aren't multiple locally optimal arrowhead designs, then actually the guided variation, the individual learning condition, everyone just converges on the single optimal design, and there everything is highly correlated. So actually, you need this multimodal fitness landscape. You need lots of different designs that are kind of locally optimal, kind of good solutions to the problem, in order to see this diversity in the individual learning condition. And then, like I said, in the payoff bias social learning condition, everybody converges on the design that the highest payoff participant happens to have found in that particular group, and that causes the convergence on a uniform type. And that's probably quite plausible. There are usually multiple ways of solving any problem in cultural evolution, and so it's probably plausible there's a multimodal fitness landscape underlying actual arrowhead designs. There's some other experimental work in experimental archaeology which shows that there are trade-offs between different attributes of arrowheads, but that seems like a plausible assumption. I guess you can also ask, why are there different learning strategies in the first place between the different sites between California and Nevada? It kind of just pushes the question up a bit further. You can ask, why do we see more payoff bias success, payoff bias social learning in Nevada compared to California? Maybe we can think in terms of the harshness of the environment in Nevada, which might constrain explorations and cause people to more tightly copy the arrowhead designs of tried and tested high payoff individuals. That's again a supposition that we'd quite like to follow up in future work. But again, you can see how the different selective forces are interacting here. We're thinking about the qualities of the traits in terms of the multimodal fitness landscape. We're thinking about ecological factors in terms of the harshness of the environment and how those are interacting with the social factor of people choosing to employ payoff biased social learning versus individual guided variation with a big component of individual learning. Okay, and finally, brief remarks on archaeology within a unified science of cultural evolution. So many years ago, myself and Andy Whiten and Kevin Leyland wrote this paper in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, which I followed up with a chapter in a book that I subsequently published called Cultural Evolution, where we argued that one of the benefits of a cultural evolution framework, as well as this population thinking, the thinking about factors at the population level and over long periods of time. Another major benefit of an evolutionary framework for studying cultural change is that we can link together different traditional disciplines of the social sciences, which for I guess the last 150 years or so since social sciences have been going, have been pretty fractionated and not really talking to each other, particularly in the latter part of the 20th century. So what we did in that paper and what I followed up with in that book and what I've kind of updated here in this talk is trying to map on the different branches of evolutionary biology that pertain to genetic evolution to different branches of the social sciences that use similar methods and have similar aims. I guess the underlying logic here is that if cultural evolution, cultural change shares the same basic underlying principles as genetic evolution does, if they're both different instances of an evolutionary process following Darwin's recipe for what evolution is, then we can maybe carve up the study of cultural evolution in a similar way to the way in which biologists have carved up, not intentionally, but naturally over time, carved up different aspects of biology to try and understand an equivalent process. So here you can see different branches of evolutionary biology ranging from macroevolutionary disciplines at the top down to which study large-scale population-level processes of speciation and adaptation, adaptive radiations, very long-term processes over in the fossil record, for example, over large periods of over large areas of space, down to the bottom where we have more individual-focused methods studying microevolution, so how gene frequencies change within populations in response to individual-level processes. And so this is maybe how you can map the different branches of the social sciences and different branches of maybe a broader unified science of cultural evolution onto these different branches of evolutionary biology. So just to talk you through it, so at the top here we've got cultural phylogenetics, which build cultural trees, evolutionary trees of cultural traits, just as systematists and phylogenetics in evolutionary biology constructs trees, evolutionary trees of different species. Archaeology, I guess, would fit into this scheme by being the equivalent alongside history of paleobiology, studying the past history of cultural traits, whether it's projectile points or handaxes or whatever. Archaeologists primarily study a cultural traits history, and often the data that archaeologists come up with are inserted into cultural phylogenies, so there's links there. Biogeography, mapping the geographical variation in species, may have its parallels in, say, sociocultural anthropology or human geography, which similarly seek to map out cultural variation across different societies. It's in the 20th century. Social anthropology has tended not to make comparisons across societies so much as study individual societies, but at least in the early 20th century there was a strong tradition in social and cultural anthropology of mapping across different societies and comparing different societies in their cultural traits. Evolutionary ecology, studying interactions between different individuals within a species, within a population, and how that feeds back into the evolutionary process, I guess has its parallel in disciplines like ethnography, history, linguistics, sociology, disciplines that again look at individual interactions within a population, within a society, within a group, and how those drive cultural change over time. Evo-Devo, which was missing from the evolutionary synthesis in the 20th century, but people are trying to reintroduce development into the study of genetic evolution. I guess might have its parallel in, say, developmental science, developmental psychology, looking at how we develop over time, how we learn to acquire cultural traits, how social learning biases themselves develop as we grow older, and may switch, say, from more social learning when we're younger to more individual learning when we're older. The experiments that I've been talking about, I guess, aiming to simulate cultural evolution in the psychology lab or also in the experimental economics lab, have their parallel in experimental evolution, studies of seeking to simulate genetic evolution in the lab using E. coli or rats or different Drosophila or different standard model organisms. Again, psychology and experimental economics has the same aims of trying to simulate cultural evolution under controlled conditions in the lab. Molecular genetics, doing what Darwin, what was missing from Darwin's scheme, which was how actually genetic inheritance works, may have its parallel perhaps in neuroscience, trying to understand how cultural traits are instantiated in the brain, how it works in the brain when we learn from another person, how cultural evolution occurs in the brain. And finally, theoretical biology or population genetics models form the foundation of the evolutionary synthesis in evolutionary biology, which kind of brought all of these different disciplines together, and theoretical cultural evolution models that, say, Cavalli, Sforza and Feldman or Boyd and Richardson pioneered in the 1970s, 1980s, kind of have the same aim of trying to model cultural evolution and ideally informing all of these different branches of cultural evolution. So I guess the work that I've talked about here, just to illustrate that maybe the benefit of taking this broader view of cultural evolution and thinking about a broader science of cultural evolution, that's kind of what we've been trying to do with these studies, where we've been running psychology experiments where people make handaxes, design arrowheads or size handaxes, so linking to archaeological artifacts, testing theoretical models of cultural evolution, whether it's models of payoff bias, unguided variation, or whether it's the accumulated copying error model in the handax study. So we're testing theoretical models using psychology experiments in order to try and understand aspects of the archaeological record. So I like to think, again, a huge benefit of a cultural evolution framework is that it just makes these links easier between different disciplines that traditionally operate fairly separately, quite almost entirely separately. So think of, say, psychology and archaeology. Usually they're in different faculties within universities, let alone talking to each other and trying to exchange theories within a common framework. Okay, so I'll end there and simply thank my collaborators and co-authors who've worked on many of these studies that I've talked about and informed my thinking in all of this work, and thank my funders, and if you're interested in any of this work, all of the papers are available on my website, or drop me an email at my email address there. Thank you very much for your time, and sorry again I couldn't make it in person to Cambridge, but hopefully this gives you a taster of what I would have presented, and thank you again to Simon and the other organisers for organising such a fascinating seminar series.